A Guide for the Perplexed. Western Esotericism. Forward. We might as well begin by spilling the secret. The ultimate objective of this book, and of the field of study that it seeks to introduce, is to change the reader's perspective on Western culture and society. We will be concerned with basic assumptions about reality, knowledge, and history that have been taken for granted by Europeans since antiquity, and more particularly since the Enlightenment, and that have spread over large parts of the world in our era of globalization. However, the perspective from which we will be looking at these issues may seem counterintuitive at first sight. We will be concentrating precisely on those worldviews, practices, and ways of knowing that have not succeeded in becoming dominant and have therefore been marginalized as rejected knowledge since the Age of Enlightenment. Under the not entirely satisfactory label of Western Esotericism, yes. Many have complained about it, but nobody has come up with a better terminology. Research in this domain has been developing quite rapidly since the 1990s. However, reliable introductions are still very rare, and it remains extremely difficult for non-specialists to distinguish fiction from fact and gain some kind of overview of what the field is all about. This guide for the perplexed is conceived as a practical and accessible guide into Western esotericism as a field of study, and it hopes to provide readers with the basic knowledge and tools that will enable them to explore it further. It is primarily written for students and teachers in the humanities and the social sciences, but it should also be of interest to general educated readers who are curious about these topics and would like to learn more about them. While the book seeks to cover the domain in all its dimensions, of course, within the limits imposed by the modest format of an introductory textbook, it does not just repeat information already well known to specialists, but presents a deliberate agenda, a vision of how the field should develop into the future. Key terms in that regard are historicity, complexity, openness, and or transdisciplinarity. Although some of its students seem to be of a different opinion, the study of esotericism is never just about esotericism in itself, whatever that may be. On the contrary, it is always about more general, larger, even universal problems and questions that should be of eminent interest to all educated persons. Therefore, one could not pay a worse service to Western esotericism than by leaving it to specialized scholars of esotericism alone. On the contrary, we will see that its materials are extremely relevant to historians, philosophers, scientists, theologians, art historians, musicologists, literary scholars or students of popular culture, and even to sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, or political scientists. Like the exterritorial waters on the global map, Western esotericism does not belong to anybody in particular and can therefore be freely explored by all. So this guide for the perplexed is meant as an open invitation for students and scholars to explore it. Without any exaggeration, esotericism stands for the single most neglected and misunderstood domain of research in the humanities, at least as far as Western culture is concerned, and this means that the possibility, even the probability, of new discoveries and surprising new insights is nowhere so great as precisely here. How can one possibly resist such a temptation? And why should one? The hope is that many readers will give in to it wholeheartedly, and set out on expeditions of their own. On the following pages they will find a roadmap and some good travel advice, but what they will encounter on their journey is theirs to find out. Chapter 1. What is Western Esotericism? Esotericism seems an elusive concept, referring to a no less elusive domain of study. The term tends to evoke strong associations in almost everybody's mind. Sometimes positive, often highly negative, but nobody finds it easy to explain what it means, let alone why we should be paying serious attention to it. Nevertheless, it is a fact that Western esotericism has been on the agenda of the academic study of religion for several decades now, and is attracting ever more attention in other disciplines of the humanities as well. Behind this development lies a growing recognition that, in our conventional ways of thinking about Western culture and its history, we may have been overlooking something important. Next to the well-known pillars of our official European and American cultural identity, the normative religious traditions of Judaism and Christianity, rational philosophy and modern science, yet another dimension seems to exist, about which we are usually not so well informed. Within the modest limitations imposed by an introductory textbook, this guide for the perplexed hopes to fill that hiatus. As a first step towards understanding what Western esotericism is all about, let us begin with a simple observation. Regardless of how this field of study is defined, it clearly does not fit within any of the established disciplines and the fields that they study. Somehow it does not really look like religion, as commonly understood, but it does not appear to be a form of philosophy either, nor would it be accepted as science today. Nevertheless, it participates in all these fields, as well as in the arts, and yet it cannot be reduced to either of them and has been seriously neglected by all. Prior to the watershed of the 18th century, when the academic disciplines began to be established in their present form, the domain in question was still widely recognized as an important, although controversial, focus of intellectual and scholarly inquiry. Theologians, philosophers, and practitioners of the natural sciences were seriously debating its ideas and their implications. It is only in the wake of the Enlightenment that it vanished almost completely from accepted intellectual discourse and standard textbook narratives. The field now became academically homeless, so to speak, and the level of general and expert knowledge about it declined dramatically during the 19th century. It is only after World War II, and increasingly since the 1990s, that this situation has begun to improve, but for the time being, popular perceptions of esotericism are still dominated by the largely misleading products of amateur scholarship and the commercial media. From a scholarly point of view, it is peculiar, to say the least, that a vast and complicated domain of religious and intellectual activity that, as will be seen, has been a pervasive presence in Western culture from late antiquity to the present should have been ignored by the Academy as if it did not exist, or treated as if it should not exist. The reasons and historical backgrounds to this phenomenon, which has no parallel in intellectual history, will be explored in Chapter 3. At this point, we only need to note that the history of academic exclusion and neglect has had problematic effects even with respect to basic scholarly terminology. Without exception, all the available terms or labels have their origin in heavily polemical or apologetic contexts, and are therefore loaded with pejorative connotations in general academic discourse. Although Western esotericism has become the label of preference among specialists since the 1990s, among the general public it still evokes associations primarily with contemporary, New Age phenomena. Likewise, terms such as the occult or occultism have been defined in a precise sense by contemporary scholars, but carry doubtful associations in wider society. The sober truth is that all the available labels tend to create misleading images of what the field is all about. A neutral and generally accepted terminology simply does not exist, and if one were to try and remedy this situation by inventing a new label from scratch, this would not help because nobody would recognize it as pertaining to the field in question. The emerging consensus among contemporary specialists is to deal with these dilemmas by sticking to Western esotericism as the overall umbrella term, in spite of its disadvantages. The hope is that as serious scholarship develops, the label will eventually lose its pejorative connotations. From definitions to prototypes. What, then, do we mean by Western esotericism? The adjective esoteric first appeared in the 2nd century CE, but the substantive is of relatively recent date. It seems to have been coined in German, esoteric, in 1792, migrated to French scholarship, esotericism, by 1828 and appeared in English in 1883.1. This means that Western esotericism is not a natural term but an artificial category, applied retrospectively to a range of currents and ideas that were known by other names at least prior to the end of the 18th century. It also means that, originally, not all those currents and ideas were necessarily seen as belonging together. As will be discussed in Chapter 3, it is only as recently as the later 17th century that we find the first attempts at presenting them as one single, coherent field or domain, and at explaining what they have in common. In short, Western esotericism is a modern scholarly construct, not an autonomous tradition that already existed out there and merely needed to be discovered by historians. This does not mean, however, that there is nothing real about the field. On the contrary, the category of Western esotericism emerged because intellectuals and historians became attentive to structural similarities that actually did exist between the ideas and worldviews of a wide variety of thinkers and movements. We will look more closely at those commonalities in Chapters 4 and 5. Several modern scholars have attempted to define the nature of Western esotericism by proposing sets of criteria to which one might refer in order to decide whether something does or does not belong to the field. The most famous and influential example comes from the French pioneer in this domain, Antoine Favre, who in 1992 offered a list of 4 intrinsic characteristics of esotericism: correspondences, living nature, imagination/mediations, transmutation, next to 2 non-intrinsic ones, transmission, concordance. Point 2. Other scholars have criticized Favre's criteria and proposed alternative approaches, resulting in a spectrum of theories and definitions that differ considerably in how they demarcate the historical and conceptual boundaries of the field as a whole. Point 3. In order to understand what is really at stake in these technical debates, let us make a brief excursion to modern theories of cognition. As pointed out by the anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann, in an entirely different context, in everyday practice we do not usually categorize things by means of formal lists of criteria, but, rather, by comparing them to prototypes. A prototype is a cluster of characteristics that is seen as constituting a good example of a class. When you use prototypes in your thinking, you ask whether the item in question resembles the best example of that class, not whether it meets specified rules or criteria of that category. Is an ostrich a bird or a grazing animal? A prototype user asks himself whether the ostrich is more like a sparrow or more like a cow, relying both on what he can see and on an array of background theory and assumptions. When you look at a piece of furniture to decide whether it is a table or a chair, you do not list the rules of membership in the table and chair categories in your mind. That takes time. It also often does not work, since many category members do not have all the apparent criteria of the class. A bird that cannot fly, like the penguin, is still a bird. You do not ask yourself whether this chair meets the criteria for chairship. You look at it, and you know it's a chair. Point 4. Scholars have provided various sets of formal criteria to define what should or should not fall under the category of Western esotericism, but in reality they are almost always reasoning by prototype. That is to say, they already have some best examples in mind of the class that they see as Western esotericism, and then proceed to compare specific historical phenomena to that model. Depending on the models they have in mind, certain historical currents may be included by some scholars but excluded by others, and this accounts for most of the confusion about the field and its boundaries. The three most common models underlying current concepts of Western esotericism appear to be the following. 1. An enchanted pre-Enlightenment worldview with ancient roots but flourishing in the early modern period. 2. A wide array of occult currents and organizations that emerged after the Enlightenment as alternatives to traditional religion and rational science. 3. A universal, inner, spiritual dimension of religion as such. Model 1. Early modern enchantment. If one looks more closely at the famous criteria proposed by Antoine Favre, one will notice that they actually read like a definition of enchantment, set against the disenchanted worldviews associated with post-Cartesian, post-Newtonian, and positivist science. Favre's notion of correspondences has its ultimate origin in Plotinus' notion of sympathy. 5. It suggests that all parts of the universe are interrelated without a need for intermediary links or causal chains, and is therefore clearly meant as an alternative to linear or instrumental causality. Living nature stands against mechanistic worldviews as well. It means that the world is conceived of as a living organism permeated by an invisible life force, not as a dead mechanism or clockwork. The notion of imagination/mediations suggests a multi-leveled Platonic cosmology, as opposed to a cosmos reducible to only matter in motion, and it suggests not only that there are various subtle levels of reality intermediary between the poles of pure spirit and pure matter, but also that we may gain access to them by means of the imagination, which is therefore an organ of knowledge and not just a fabricator of illusions, as held by Enlightenment rationalism. Transmutation, finally, refers to a process by means of which man or nature may be changed into a higher spiritual state or even attain a divine condition. In short, esotericism, according to Favre's definition, looks like a radical alternative to the disenchanted worldviews that came to dominate Western culture in the wake of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and positivist science. For Favre himself, the prototypes par excellence of Western esotericism are to be found in a movement in early modern culture, roughly from Paracelsus in the 16th century to the Romantic era, that is known as Christian Theosophy and Native philosophy, and to which we will return below. Accordingly, whether any other religious or intellectual currents should be seen as forms of esotericism depends on how close they are to these best examples of the class. In practice, this means that the early modern period looms largest in Favre's work, as the golden age when Western esotericism flourished like never before or after. Ancient and medieval sources are acknowledged as a necessary background, rather than as manifestations of esotericism in their own right. And most importantly, it remains somewhat questionable, and never fully explained in Favre's oeuvre, whether the many esoteric or occultist currents that developed through the 19th and 20th centuries up to the present are still close enough to the theosophical/native philosophical prototype to qualify as esotericism at all. In terms of Lerman's analogy, if esotericism is an enchanted sparrow that clearly differs from a disenchanted cow, then these post-Enlightenment forms of esotericism seem to be hybrid animals that might easily be dismissed as pseudo-esotericisms. Favre is the most prominent but certainly not the only scholar who understands esotericism as a prototypical worldview of enchantment, opposed to the disenchanted worldviews of modern and contemporary society, and points to the early modern period as its golden age. From a very different perspective and with different arguments, the English historian Frances Yates created a similar perspective with her extremely influential grand narrative of the Hermetic tradition of the Renaissance. Point 6, as presented by Yates. This tradition emerged from the rediscovery and translation of a collection of texts from late antiquity, the Corpus Hermeticum, by the Florentine philosopher Marsilio Ficino, see Chapter 2. In the wake of this translation, published in 1471, Renaissance Hermeticism flourished during the 16th and 17th centuries as a worldview dominated by magic, personal experience and the powers of the imagination. It promoted a world-affirming mysticism consonant with an enchanted and holistic science that looked at nature as a living, organic whole, permeated by invisible forces and energies. And, still according to Yeats, it reflected a confident, optimistic, forward-looking perspective that emphasized humanity's potential to operate on the world by using the new sciences, and thus create a better, more harmonious, more beautiful society. Like Faber's Western esotericism, Francis Yates' Hermetic tradition flourished during the early modern period as an enchanted alternative to established religion and rationalistic science. Its literary sources went back to late antiquity, but Yeats drew a sharp dividing line between the dark Middle Ages and the new phenomenon of a beautiful and elegant Hermetic magic in Renaissance culture. More sharply and decisively than in Faber's narrative, she claimed that the Hermetic tradition had come to an end during the 17th century with the rise of modern philology and natural science. But many of her enthusiastic readers during the 1960s and 1970s went a step further. At the dawn of modernity, so they understood, the magical and enchanted worldview of the Renaissance had lost the battle against the Christian and scientific establishment, after which the very memory of its existence had been suppressed and almost destroyed. For some of them, the newly rediscovered Hermetic tradition became a source of inspiration in their own struggle with the contemporary political, religious and scientific establishment, and their attempts to re-enchant the world and bring the imagination back to power. This made Yeats' narrative highly relevant to contemporary concerns. Many of those who were involved in, or sympathetic to, the new magical or spiritual movements flourishing since the 1960s began to look at Renaissance Hermeticism as their own predecessors. Yeats and Faber are the most prominent examples of an approach that makes esotericism into the model of an enchanted worldview flourishing from the Renaissance until the Enlightenment. An important implication is that, by definition, esotericism must be at odds with the secular world and can never be seen as an integral dimension of modern culture and society. Even if it manages to survive under post-Enlightenment conditions, it can only do so as an anti-modernist counterculture engaged in an ultimately hopeless flight from reason. 7 This, at least, is how many sociologists during the 1960s and 1970s in fact looked at the surprising boom of new religious movements and occultist currents during that period. The dominant secularization thesis claimed that religion and magic could have no future in an age of science and increasing rationalization. And so this occult revival, along with the Oriental Renaissance, had to be dismissed as a manifestation of irrationalism and futile longing for a romanticized past.
Model 2. The Post-Modern Occult.
There is no doubt that modern and contemporary manifestations of esotericism, from the 18th century up to the present, proclaim ideas and convictions that have their historical origins in pre-Enlightenment models. We will encounter many examples in what follows. But it would be a mistake to assume that these traditional worldviews have persisted simply as survivals from the past, continuing in their original form without being affected or changed by the impact of modern trends and developments. That magical, esoteric or occultist concepts are inherently static and resistant to change is a positivist cliché that has been disproved time and time again. 8 On the contrary, as will be seen in Chapter 7, ideas and worldviews inherited from pre- and early modern periods were thoroughly transformed from the 19th century on, under the impact of new cultural and intellectual developments in secular society, with new, surprising, and unprecedented results. As we have seen, the first model implies that such post-Enlightenment forms of esotericism can never be more than second-hand, derivative or defective deformations of the real thing. By compromising with secular thought, the integrity and authenticity of esotericism must necessarily be impaired, and so its modern and contemporary manifestations fall short of full identification with the model and its prototypical examples. But it is perfectly possible to turn the argument around. After all, or so it can be argued, it is only after the 18th century that esotericism or the occult began to emerge as a social phenomenon in its own right. Before that time it had been just an intellectual tradition manifested in learned and popular writings, but only now did it take the form of actual organizations and social networks that began to compete with the established churches on a pluralistic market of religion. From such a perspective, precisely the occult as manifested in modern and contemporary culture is the central core phenomenon, and so it is here that we can expect to find the best examples or prototypes of what Western esotericism is all about. Earlier periods may be of interest for providing some historical background, but are not crucial or central to understanding the occult, and any formal criteria for defining and demarcating the field must be derived from its post-Enlightenment manifestations. Programmatic statements of this position are far more difficult to find than in the case of the first model, because its main representatives tend to come from the social sciences and are seldom very interested in broader historical contextualizations. Their main focus is on what exists here and now, and much less on where it may have come from. In other words, we are not dealing here with any explicit, or even implicit, theory or conviction about the nature and historical development of esotericism before and after the Enlightenment, but simply with an interest in studying the occult as a phenomenon in modern or contemporary popular culture. Point 9. In this second model, esotericism, or the occult, does not function as an object of nostalgia for a lost or forgotten enchanted worldview, but as a dimension of the here and now, with implications for the future. When sociologists first began studying the occult during the 1960s and 1970s, they saw it as a surprising and somehow disconcerting phenomenon of social deviance, concerned with anomalous claims of knowledge that seemed to reflect a movement of youthful rebellion against science and established religion. Point 10. They had trouble seeing anything else in it than a heartfelt but obviously futile reaction against rationalization and the forward march of modernity. In more recent years, however, sociologists and historians of religion have begun to see the occult as a significant manifestation of modernity. Point 11. Predictions about the imminent demise of religion have turned out to be premature, to say the least, and it has become ever more evident that esoteric or occult currents are a permanent feature of modern culture. They have been around since the birth of modernity, and whether we like it or not, it seems that they are here to stay. In current scholarship, the occult is therefore no longer perceived as a marginal and irritating anomaly, something that should not be there, but, on the contrary, as a highly important manifestation of how religion is continuously being reinvented under new historical and social conditions. For example, the rapid expansion of new information and communication technologies since the 1990s, and the spectacular development of new media during the same period, now seems to result in a postmodern occult that, among other things, playfully but deliberately blurs the boundaries between fiction and reality. It should be noticed that in the emerging scholarship about such topics, notions of the occult tend to be used rather vaguely, and mostly as shorthand for anything touching on the psychic or paranormal. For example, scholars of religion are now pointing to the fascination with superpowers in popular comics or role-playing games as a significant example of how the sacred manifests itself in contemporary popular culture. Point 12. Far from referring to any specific historical tradition, then, the occult tends to be understood in much of current scholarship as just a convenient modern term for strange phenomena and radical experiences that, presumably, have been reported from all times and places and are obviously still with us in modern and contemporary society. Such research is recognized in the present introduction as an important part of the study of Western esotericism, but still as one dimension only. The essential weakness of the first model outlined above, that of early modern enchantment, is that it is not capable of taking modern and contemporary forms of esotericism completely seriously on their own terms. It perceives them only in relation to their pre-Enlightenment forebears, who must necessarily be superior by comparison. But the weakness of the second model lies in its lack of historical depth. It does take the modern and contemporary occult seriously on its own terms, but fails to recognize that the roots and origins of any phenomenon are an inextricable part of that phenomenon itself. Studying the occult without placing it in historical perspective is a bit like reducing 9/11 to a terrorist act, period, while dismissing the history of Islamic radicalism or Western colonialist politics as irrelevant to understanding what it was and why it happened. Likewise, against the anti-historical drift of the second model, we will fail to understand the occult unless we integrate its study in a wider historical context. But in doing so, against the anti-modern drift of the first model, we should take it as seriously as its pre-Enlightenment forebears.
Model 3. Inner Traditions.
According to a third influential model of Western esotericism, the term stands for inner traditions concerned with a universal spiritual dimension of reality, as opposed to the merely external, exoteric, religious institutions and dogmatic systems of established religions. This model stays closest to the original meaning of the adjective esoteric in late antiquity, when it referred to secret teachings reserved for a spiritual elite, such as the Pythagorean brotherhoods or some mystery cults. Exoteric teachings, according to this model, are meant for the uneducated masses that can be kept satisfied with mere ritual observance and dogmatic belief systems. Underneath the surface of conventional religion, however, there are deeper truths that are known only to initiates into the true mysteries of religion and philosophy. According to this model, the true esoteric spirituality must ultimately be one, independent of social, historical, or cultural circumstances. Regardless of the tradition in which one has been raised, those who refuse to be satisfied with outward appearances and limited dogmatic systems will always be able to find access to the universal truth about the nature of the world, of divinity and of human destiny to which all the great mystics and spiritual teachers have been referring. Therefore, Western esotericism is only one part of a much larger domain. The esoteric teachings of all non-Western religions and cultures, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, shamanism, and so on, must ultimately point towards the same esoteric reality underneath surface appearances. In the modern science of religion, the study of historical currents in search of such an inner universal dimension is technically known as religionism. Point 13. With various degrees of emphasis, and sometimes with considerable subtlety and sophistication, this agenda has strongly influenced the way in which religion has been studied after World War II, especially in the United States under the influence of Mircea Eliade and his school, and some of the most influential scholars of Western esotericism, from Henry Corbin and Antoine Faivre in his earlier work, to contemporary authors such as Arthur Versluys and even Nicholas Goodrich-Clarke, have been inspired clearly by religionist agendas. But while the study of Western esotericism owes much to the work of these pioneers, the mainstream of scholarship has begun to move away from religionist approaches since the 1990s and increasingly since the beginning of the 21st century. The reason is that the inner dimensions model, which in one way or another underlies all forms of religionism, has some highly problematic implications. Most importantly, and most obviously, it rests upon the conviction that a universal, hidden, esoteric dimension of reality really does exist. Scholarly methods, however, are exoteric by definition and can only study what is empirically available to observers regardless of their personal convictions. The Academy has no instruments for gaining direct access to the true and absolute nature of reality that is claimed to exist according to this model, and it has no methodologies for either verifying or falsifying the claim that such a reality exists in the first place. The absolute or the divine is simply not a possible object of research. All that scholars can do is study the beliefs, convictions or theories that have been formulated about it, but as scholars they are not qualified to assess their truth or falsity. Initially, many students of esotericism find this disappointing and frustrating, but it is a simple matter of recognizing the limitations of what scholarly research can and cannot do. Some academics claim that since science and scholarship cannot discover the divine or the absolute, it therefore does not exist. However, it is logically more consistent to admit that we simply do not know and cannot know. This position, which neither affirms nor denies that it might be possible to discover the true nature of reality by other means than science and scholarship, such as spiritual techniques or mystical contemplation, is technically known as methodological agnosticism. The model of esotericism as the inner dimension of reality is also problematic from the perspective of strictly historical research. If all that really matters about esotericism is the one universal truth, this leaves little or no room for recognizing or giving attention to historical specificity, individual creativity, novelty, change, and development. But historians are bound to emphasize that, claims to unity and universality notwithstanding, there are in fact enormous differences between various esoteric currents and ideas in different historical periods and social contexts. Hermetic texts from antiquity, theosophical visionaries like Jacob Boehme or Emanuel Swedenborg, occultist magicians like Aleister Crowley, contemporary New Agers, and so on, have extremely different and often mutually exclusive worldviews and agendas that are typical of their specific historical and social context. Religionists tend to play down the importance of such contextual factors because they see them as merely external and ultimately irrelevant with respect to the all-important inner dimension. As a result, the study of esotericism, for them, amounts to providing illustrative examples of thinkers and practitioners who best exemplify what they themselves see as true and eternally valid, with reference to criteria, as we have just seen, that remain inaccessible for normal scholars. In this introduction, none of these three models will be the normative basis of discussion. We will be looking at Western esotericism as a radically pluralistic field of currents, ideas and practices that can be studied from late antiquity to the present day, without seeking to privilege any historical period or any particular worldview as more truly esoteric, i.e. closer to some preferred model, than any other. From that perspective, there is no such thing as a best example of esotericism, and there are no prototypical esotericists. But obviously, such an approach begs the question of definition and demarcation, for it still assumes that the field as a whole can be set apart as somehow different from other fields of inquiry. On what basis, then, can we do so? Very briefly, and with reference to the opening paragraph of this chapter, the field that we now call Western esotericism may be described as the chief casualty of academic specialization after the 18th century. What initially sets it apart is its modern status as rejected knowledge. It contains precisely everything that has been consigned to the dustbin of history by Enlightenment ideologues and their intellectual heirs up to the present, because it is considered incompatible with normative concepts of religion, rationality, and science. Imagined as the radical counterpart of everything that educated people are expected to take seriously, the consensus among mainstream intellectuals after the 18th century was that this domain should better be avoided and ignored in academic discourse, rather than being dignified by detailed study and analysis of its ideas and their development. We will see that this process of exclusion and neglect did not just happen overnight. On the contrary, It was the final outcome of a long history of apologetic and polemical battles and negotiations, beginning in late antiquity, about the question of which worldviews and approaches to knowledge should be considered acceptable and which ones should be rejected. It is through these debates that the emerging religious and intellectual elites have been defining their own identity. That Western esotericism is the Academy's dustbin of rejected knowledge does not imply that it is just a random collection of discarded materials without any further connection. On the contrary, a broad consensus had emerged around the 18th century about the chief characteristics of the rejected domain. Although one can never take polemical narratives at face value, almost by definition, they exaggerate and simplify for maximum effect. Those characteristics do in fact correspond to recognizable worldviews and approaches to knowledge that have played an important although always controversial role in the history of Western culture. In the rest of this book we will be studying a large and complicated field of research that 1. Has been set apart by mainstream religious and intellectual culture as the other, by which it defines its own identity, and 2. Is characterized by a strong emphasis on specific worldviews and epistemologies that are at odds with normative post-Enlightenment intellectual culture. This is the closest we will get to a definition of Western esotericism. Point 14. The first element is discussed in Chapter 3, the second in Chapters 4 and 5. The rest of the West: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. What do we mean, exactly, when we refer to this field as Western esotericism? There are several ways of answering that question, and we will see that they carry important implications with respect to the nature of this field of research and its essential agendas. Since there is much confusion about these issues, it is important to address them explicitly. An initial point of concern is that the terminology might easily suggest some fundamental East-West distinction within the field of esotericism as a whole, implying that there must be an Oriental esotericism next to the Occidental variety. We have seen that the religionist perspective based on the prototype of inner dimensions makes precisely that assumption. Since it holds that personal inner access to universal spiritual truths is available to all human beings in principle, Western esotericism must have its parallels in the East. The logical result of such a perspective is that the study of esotericism turns into a form of comparative religious studies that seeks to discover the universalia of inner religion worldwide. But whatever one might think of such a project in itself, it is certainly not representative of the study of Western esotericism as understood here. Even apart from the problematic nature of religionism as such, see above, comparative studies of religious experience on religionist foundations have no need for the esotericism label. Such lines of research have developed and organized themselves independently, ever since the 19th century, and now have well-developed agendas, networks and bodies of literature all of their own. For sure there is much in Western esotericism that is bound to interest students in this field, and it is certainly true that much can be learned from systematic comparisons between Western and Eastern forms of experiential religion, but the two programs simply do not coincide. To avoid any confusion, then, it should be clear that the adjective Western is not understood here as a qualifier within a larger field, demarcating the Occidental section of some general worldwide esotericism. On the contrary, it is meant to highlight the specificity of esotericism understood as an inherently Western domain of research, in contrast to globalizing or universalizing understandings of the term. But making any such claim brings up another important issue regarding the notion of Western esotericism. The category of rejected knowledge that emerged during the Enlightenment, and that we have inherited, is the final outcome of complicated apologetic and polemical debates dominated by Christian intellectuals from antiquity to the 18th century. It has sometimes been argued that referring to such a category as Western esotericism is inappropriate because that label implicitly marginalizes the important role of Jewish and Islamic esoteric currents in the history of religion in Europe. This argument carries considerable weight, for it is true that traditional grand narratives of the Christian Occident, essentially based on models adopted from church history, used to highlight the role of establishment Christianity in Europe at the expense of almost everything else. Such approaches are rightly criticized by modern scholars who emphasize that, to the contrary, religion in Europe has always been marked by religious diversity and pluralistic competition. Point 15. Next to Christianity and its various denominations, Judaism and Islam should be seen as integral parts of the story of religion in Europe, and the same goes for the various pagan traditions from antiquity and indigenous European cultures that continued to exert an important influence in learned discourse and popular practice. From such a perspective, it may seem natural to conclude that any field that calls itself Western esotericism must cover Occidental culture in all its complexity and diversity, and should therefore give equal attention to esoteric traditions in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Although strong arguments can be adduced in favor of such an approach, at least in theory, for a combination of reasons we will not adopt it in this guide. An initial and rather pragmatic reason is that both Jewish and Islamic mysticism, another problematic term, that still tends to be preferred over esotericism by most scholars in these fields, have already developed as relatively autonomous and independent fields of research, and there is no particular need to duplicate those bodies of scholarship here under another label. Additionally, there are limits to the possibilities for interdisciplinary research across the borders of these different fields, mainly for linguistic reasons. One will not make much headway in the study of Kabbalah without being fluent in Hebrew and Aramaic, or in Sufism without deep knowledge of Arabic or Persian, and much of the relevant modern scholarship is simply not available in English or other modern Western languages. All this puts serious practical constraints on the attractive ideal of a comparative esotericism of the three Abrahamic religions. It is probably for this reason that even the most vocal defenders of such an inclusive program of Western esotericism have not been able to put it into practice. A second argument has to do with the internal histories of the relevant traditions in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cultures. Scholars have become much more attentive in recent years to the importance of interconfessional exchange and discursive transfer across the boundaries of established religions, and this is an important corrective to the idea that the monotheistic or scriptural religions developed each in some kind of splendid isolation. But the point should not be exaggerated. It still remains the case that Jewish and Islamic forms of esotericism have emerged and developed as largely self-contained and relatively autonomous traditions, accessible during most of their histories only to pious Jews and Muslims within their own respective communities. The simple reason is, again, that they required fluency in the relevant languages and deep familiarity with their respective holy scriptures. One cannot study classical Jewish Kabbalah without intimate knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and its commentaries, or understand Islamic mysticism without access to the poetic language of the Quran in Arabic. Unless one adopts an extreme religionist perspective, by which anything external derives from some universal inner source, this in itself makes it quite implausible a priori that more or less the same kind of esotericism would have developed independently in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic contexts. There is much more reason to emphasize the specificity and relative uniqueness of each. This point can be illustrated by the example of the very term, esotericism. In the Jewish context, it has to do with complex procedures for disclosing hidden or secret levels of meaning of the Torah. In Christian contexts, much of the concern with secrecy or hidden knowledge is indebted, rather, to the concept of occult, hidden qualities in nature. And in Islamic cultures, not just in their mystical or esoteric forms of expression, but even in the very text of the Quran itself, Surah 57.3, we find a fundamental distinction between the apparent or outward dimension of reality, Zahir, and its hidden or inward dimension, Batin. The list could be extended. Although they all have to do something with secrecy or concealment, these are very different concepts with different historical and conceptual backgrounds, which cannot be reduced to one another without simplification and distortion. In short, it is by no means so easy as it might seem to demonstrate some basic underlying structure that allows us to see Jewish, Christian, and Islamic forms of esotericism as variants of essentially one and the same field. In all likelihood, the very idea of such a transconfessional esotericism common to the monotheistic or scriptural religions has emerged as a preoccupation of post-Enlightenment scholars. In this guide we will therefore concentrate on the lineage that runs from late antiquity through predominantly Western Christian culture up to the Enlightenment, and the subsequent development of modern and secular culture up to the present. Obviously, we will give due attention to interactions and exchanges with Jewish, Byzantine, and Islamic culture wherever that is relevant, but the dialectics with pagan traditions inherited from late antiquity will prove to be more important in explaining why the field assumed a status of relative autonomy. It remains true that the very term Western esotericism could be seen as reflecting an unfortunate hegemonizing perspective, which, against the evidence that religious pluralism has been the rule in Western culture, marginalizes Judaism and Islam in Europe in order to promote an ideological Christendom narrative. But alternatively, it could be argued that this is precisely the point. As will be seen in Chapter 3, the very perception of Western esotericism as a domain of its own did in fact emerge as a singularizing and hegemonizing construct, directed, however, against paganism rather than against Judaism.